Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So, I did a video yesterday talking about a contest connected to my graphic novel, Thomas Valiant. The link is in the description for my graphic novel if you wish to go and check it out. And when I talked about this contest where you can win up to $400 worth of merchandise, I just actually followed a formula and I went bit by bit by bit through the entire thing. And I realized after I was done with it that I can be pretty boring. I actually, when I stick to my format, can be long-winded and actually say a whole lot of nothing in about half an hour. So today I'm hopefully going to give you a shorter video, or at the very least an off-the-cuff video, where I talk about virtue and hero and storytelling and something that happened to me this week. Hopefully I can be as clear as I normally am. So, I was talking to someone on Twitter. I got someone contacting me, I think a young man, talking to me about his writing a comic book, or at the very least doing fan fiction which included fan art. And he asked a very simple question, and I often find that simple questions are the best question. And he said, if I'm doing something like a comic book with comic book characters, can I include stuff with normal everyday life? And I thought to myself, well, yeah, you can do that, especially. So my answer to him was the fact that yes and no. You can include that, but first of all, you have to realize what your audience is there for and give it to them, which basically means that if you wish to incorporate other things, then you need to work around why your audience is actually there to begin with and incorporate that into what they are looking for. But at the same time, I would say that being a hero is being truly human. And the thing is that in order to be truly human, yes, you have to actually go through everyday stuff. It can't be giant explosions and the universe going to end at every moment. There has to be some humanity in there, especially if you're a traditional hero. Because again, being a traditional hero means being ultimately human, and there has to be human elements in there if you actually are a traditional hero. So, thinking about this got my mind rolling on the idea of virtue, and not just its definition, but its actual implementation and its action. Because to talk about virtue as the thing is in itself, which is what I searched for so long, is different than talking about virtue as an action. Virtue as it is, in some part, lived out within your life. Now, very briefly, and I would like to do an entire video on this at some point, when talking about virtue and the definition of a thing in itself, I actually go back to Augustine of Hippo. I think his definition is the clearest definition, although it is very poetic, when he says that a good short definition of virtue in itself is that it is the order of love. And this goes back to his description of the idea of will, which we still use today, and talking about how when you will something, it's all because of love. You're placing your love on something, and therefore, if your love is moving you away from this thing or towards this thing, this is what your will is. And to paraphrase him, he would say that this order of love is the order of recognizing what is, where your love is supposed to be placed, where it isn't supposed to be placed, and the order of how really intense your love needs to be for certain things, because some things elicit more love than others. You should love, as Plato would say, the truth above all things. But again, as I said, I'm not going to talk too much about that. That's the definition of the thing in itself. But as an operation, virtue is indeed very connected to power. Now, this is something that I talk about a lot because when I go in depth into these quote-unquote progressive people and their podcasts, they talk about power all the time. But they talk about it in a way that is contrary to what virtue actually is. Or to say that all in another way, there certainly can be a good use of power, but that good use of power needs to be tied to virtue. Indeed, virtue itself is power. It is the power for you to accomplish your ends. And this is the operation of what virtue is in itself. So let's, for example, take the virtue of justice. You wish to be just. You wish to get to the ends of being just. In order to get there, you need to have the virtue of justice, that operation of justice, in order to get to that objective point of justice. So the operation and the thing in itself are different. And you need to do that by recognizing what comes before. That is to say, what is. And this is exactly what right reason is, which you need before all else. You need to recognize, first and foremost, what the definition of justice is according to reality, which, as Western civilization has defined it, justice is the rendering to each man what is their due. So first of all, you have to use your right reason, recognize what is true, recognizing the truth of many different things. What you are as a human being, how that actually plays out in reality, how that plays out for other people, and what justice itself is. And so when you recognize all of these things according to right reason, then you can be prudent. That is to say, you can make decisions based upon what you know actually is, and therefore they are prudent decisions. And that allows you to accomplish what you set out to do when you begin to move toward the thing that you place your love on. And once you do that, once you first have access to right reason and then incorporate it into your life with prudence, then you can move on to justice, which comes next, because you're treating yourself according to what is true, and you're making prudent decisions. Now you can do that for other people as well, because again, according to the definition of justice, you are rendering to every man what is their due. Therefore, you're not just being prudent towards yourself, you're also being prudent towards the other. And so it is with all of the virtues. You're trying to accomplish the end, and the virtue is giving you the power to actually accomplish that end. But the whole thing is under the structure of recognizing that what is a human being, and what is the end of a human being, and how do these ends which I'm trying to accomplish actually meet the ends of what a human being is supposed to fulfill. All of these things are according to what is, according to reality. And again, taking all that and putting it into a simplistic form is that when you're virtuous, you're actually becoming more and more human. That's not to say that you can ever be dehumanized. You have a human nature, and that's not going to change. But in recognizing your humanity, you get to live out that humanity to its fullest extent. And this is actually something that I have incorporated into my graphic novel. A lot of people are looking at my characters and their power sets and saying, these powers can become unwieldy very quickly. They can become overpowered so quick. How are you going to keep that in check? Well, for my own part, for this story that I am writing, I want to, as I should, make it a good story, which is a good reflection of reality. And so when dealing with power, I want to deal with it in the way that it actually works out in reality. Whereas, as the common saying goes, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this is the axiom at the heart of the powers being used within my graphic novel, within these characters. Because the more that they use their powers, these superhuman powers, the less human they become. And conversely, if they wish to be more human, if they wish to be more heroic, they have to place their own limitations on the use of their powers, knowing full well that if they use them to the greatest extent that they can, they dehumanize themselves. But there is something within this system that needs to be recognized. It's the recognition always that you are directed towards the truth. You are directed towards what is. And when you accomplish an end, that end needs to be connected to a greater end. The end of what you as a human being are here for. Now that has been expressed in many different ways, in many different cultures, but most of them agree that our ends is happiness. And I fully admit, it does become a little bit complicated when you have to look at the thing as it is defined within itself and separate that from the operation of the thing. Now, in order to give you an example of how this doesn't work, we simply have to look at your quote-unquote progressives. Because, believe it or not, I'm not actually against liberalism in its traditional form. If a proponent of liberalism were actually living it out to the extent that it was originally conceived of, I would have no problem with that at all, because it was originally conceived of liberating you from that which is untrue. It usually took the form of liberating you from some kind of oppression, liberating you from an institution or something that is putting you down. There's no problem with that, as long as you recognize that what at the heart of that movement is to liberate you from what is untrue. But very quickly, this movement became corrupted and moved from liberating people from what is untrue to liberating people for the sake of liberating people, or liberty for the sake of liberty, which has no connection to what is true. And I would say this came from a position of selfishness and nothing else. Because here's the thing, if you recognize that liberalism is expected to liberate you from something that is untrue, you also have to recognize that every time you liberate yourself from what is untrue, you also bind yourself more fully by the truth. But a selfish nature corrupted that idea, because a selfish nature doesn't want to be bound by anything, and therefore they needed to reject the idea of being bound by the truth. They needed to reject even the idea that the truth can bind you, because that in itself is binding. and it became liberating you from everything that might stand in the way of your liberty, which at its heart is nothing but selfishness. And this is not something unique to liberalism. This is something, again, that Augustine talked about in the 400s AD, when he was talking about the will and saying that the will needs to be directed towards the truth. A corrupted will is a will that is directed towards itself, that is willing for the sake of willing. That is a corrupted will. Or as Plato said 800 years before Augustine, talking a little more poetically, saying that when you actually love yourself above everything else, you become blind to what is just and true and noble. Why? Because you can't see yourself objectively. You and the thing being viewed are the same, and therefore you seek the preservation of what is yours above what is true. And also, I would add that if the destination is where you are, you don't go anywhere. You're like a dog chasing its tail. You just go around and around in circles. There's no movement. There's no actual movement to get to an ends of anything. And I would say this is one of the reasons why you get these quote-unquote progressives, and they sit there like a stone, expecting everybody to move around them and what they want, whether it be you or an institution or the world. And so what your modern progressive is trying to do is to accumulate power for nothing more than the sake of accumulating power. Most notably, I would say, so they can fight against reality and simply live in their own selfish little bubble. Again, a bubble that everyone else has to move around. But being heroic, being virtuous, is quite the opposite. It recognizes that there is a truth, and this path that you need to go through in order to get to where your ends is, it must be in accord with the truth. The truth means you have to move around other things. Other things don't move around you. You have to recognize things as they exist, their objective existence, and how you, I'm sorry, but you will have to move around them. And since you're going to use that virtue, that power, to try to get to an ends, in order for you to move from point A to point F, in order for you to get there, you got to move around all the other points, which are fixed points according to what is. This, in part, is the self-sacrificial nature of virtue, the self-sacrificial nature of being a hero. You recognize I have limitations, and my limitations are according to what is real. Therefore, I'm going to have to sacrifice. I'm going to have to give something. I'm going to have to move if I want to actually get to where I want to go. If, say, I want to be, again, just. And this, to some extent, is the very definition of what it means to be human, to recognize your own existence and the existence of others and the reality that we live in and act in accord with those things. You are being fully human. You are realizing your humanity with all of that, and that is expressed through virtue. Because again, virtue is the power that allows you to move through the obstacle course of reality and get to that end which is set up for you already by the nature that is inherent within you. Virtue is the thing that allows us to be ultimately human, and so a hero needs to be ultimately human. And this is why your quote-unquote progressive stories actually fall flat. Because we are reading these stories and looking at them and understanding that these people, these characters within these stories, aren't actually acting in a way that is in accord with reality. And therefore, when they actually get to an ends within the story, you go, hey, wait a second. There's no reason they should get there. There is absolutely no reason that they could get to that ends because they're not acting in accord with reality. If anything, they should be moved farther and farther away from that ends the more the story goes on. But you recognize within your own mind, in an almost instinctual way, that they should not, with those actions, have gotten to that ends. And therefore, you recognize that this story is not a true reflection of reality, which is exactly what, according to Western civilization for thousands of years, a story is actually supposed to be, a representation of reality. And so, we look at the story and go, that's a bad story. I might not exactly be able to put my finger on why I think it's a bad story, but I recognize it's a bad story. But conversely, when we read these stories about actual heroes, and we see these actual heroes on the page, especially in something like a comic book, which I'm always talking about, in this almost, some would say, cartoonish fashion. I would say in these broad strokes that we can see very clearly, we see that this character, who's supposed to be a representation of reality, is actually living in a way that is ultimately human. We see a character down on the page that is realizing their humanity through their actions, and those actions are through the virtues that they embody. And this is why we love hero stories. It's again because we're looking at this hero and going, wow, I want to be like that. I want my life to be like that. Of course you do, because their life is a reflection of what your life should be. And there is absolutely nothing hindering you from living that same life of those heroes down on the page. You can be just as virtuous as they are. You can actually achieve your ends just like they are. Because virtuous means, in its totality, first of all, you're recognizing what things are, what you are as a human being, what reality is around you, and you're acting in accord with it, and it is allowing you to accomplish what you set out to do, and what is set out for you by your human nature. In part, we love heroes and hero stories so much because they present to us what we wish to be. They present to us that hero we can be. They present to us a reflection of reality that moves us towards being more fully human. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And of course, as always, I should remind you that I am trying to craft such a story myself within my graphic novel. If such a story appeals to you in any way, please consider clicking the link in the description for my graphic novel and going and seeing if that story is for you. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.